Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Ready, Steady, Play podcast, which I think henceforth will be called Ready, Steady Podcast. I think that was the intention, and somewhere we lost sight of that. And, of course, I'm Mike from the YouTube channel Ready, Steady, Play, and I'm joined by Barry, also a founder of Ready, Steady, Play.
Among many other strings to my bow.
Exactly. I'm a regular Renaissance man.
That's what they call me.
So we'll be diving straight into the segments of the podcast. We're going to start off with some news, some board games coming up that we're excited about, and then we're going to get into board games that we've been playing and what we think of them. I've got a few notes here on stuff that's coming up. We've got Blood, which is a new boss battler from Ludus Magnus Studios. Now, I've been paid to cover quite a lot of Ludus Magnus's games, and so I pose to you the question, Barry, are you excited about a new Ludus Magnus release?
Are Ludus Magnus DEI?
Yes, that is one of their games. Divide et Impera.
Oh, you're Latin. Flawless.
Which is, God, yeah, because you can tell I was at Oxbridge, can't you? But that is actually a bit of an outlier in their canon. Other games, of course, their big famous title is Black Rose Wars, and they've done Breach, which hasn't been delivered to backers yet. They did Nova Aetas Renaissance, which is the re-implementation of Nova Aetas, which has been delivered to backers, and they've also done Runar, which has not yet been delivered to backers, and they did the futuristic re-implementation of Nova Aetas, which was called Scene Tempore.
Do they have somebody on staff that is, Latin, classically trained? I'm only familiar with DEI, and I think it's great. In fact, they even suckered me into buying the big box eventually. So
yeah, I can say without bias, because DEI is the only one of their games they didn't pay me to cover. Right. Well, that and their latest one, which is just finished on Kickstarter, which is a sort of more of a narrative-driven adventure thing.
I don't know, I think from what I've seen, pretty solid game developers and publishers, and the boss battler is often quite interesting. So yeah, could be good. Oh,
they also did Dungeonology, which I was also not paid to cover. So Dungeonology was sort of like a push your luck kind of bag builder type thing. And then they've got the latest narrative-driven one is called Requiem, which I actually didn't cover. So, full transparency, I was paid to cover Black Rose Wars Rebirth, Runar, and Breach. And so you can find how to plays on all of those if you backed any of them on my channel. I recommend them because, they'll really help you to get to grips with those games. Now, DEI, I was not paid to cover, although I did cover a prototype, which they sent me when it was on Kickstarter. And I was not paid to cover Dungeonology either, because that sort of preceded our professional relationship. And I really like DEI. It's worth noting that is the first game from Tommaso Battista, who went on to co-design Barrage with Simone Luciani. I'm a big fan of Barrage. I like it a lot. And I actually quite like DEI, which I think, I haven't had a chance to dive into a lot of the extra Kickstarter bits yet. But the base game I've played a few times, and I found it to be pleasant,
Yeah, I've played a few games with just the core set, and with the extra factions, I've not used a lot of the extra stuff yet. So needs to get to the table more.
Yeah, I'd like to see the sort of territory argy-bargy bit exacerbated. So if there's some element in the expansions that sort of brings that to the fore a bit more, that'd be great.
There's definitely scenery, right? The Citadel and the bridge. So there must be areas of interest to fight over more in the expansions. But
yeah, if you've never seen the game, it's a sort of it looks like a troops on a map game, and it's not at all. It's actually a sort of a Euro game, which has a hand management action selection system, not unlike Concordia. And the reason it's reminiscent of that is because the card play is the actions, and the cards are also worth points, and it's actually kind of the best way to get points in the game. Where it differs from Concordia is that the cards in this are just straight points, and in Concordia you're unlocking these endgame scoring mechanisms that are exponentially more valuable. But in DEI, it's still got this sort of element of like hand improvement and points acquisition in tandem, which feels reminiscent of that. And otherwise, you're moving troops around a board through regions, and then you're collecting resources from post-apocalyptic world. And there's an area majority game where whoever has, you can only collect the resources in a zone if you have the majority of troops there. So the troops never actually fight, and you very rarely take enemy troops off the board, although there is a mechanism for that, but it's not a big part of the game. Yeah. And could be completely omitted based on how you set the game up. You know, it's all about this sort of argy-bargy area majority type thing, and there's some little king of the hill points that you want to hold as well by getting most of your troops into those zones. And yeah, I think with DEI, I find it a really nice little game of sort of optimization and logistics. I don't think in my plays it has yet ever reached sort of the point of like really tense gameplay.
I've had, well, end-game scoring, right? In terms of intense gameplay, no, because it's ebbs and flows. You take control of some area, you know you're not going to keep that to your next turn, because getting those resources is important, so people will move more people in for the majority. But the scoring at the end, I've had very, very tight games, often within 1 or 2 points. And I've done it multiple ways, both from the card purchase, sort of sneaking up from behind, having given up some of the end game or end round condition points, and I've done it by going all out on getting the most of those points in the round that they're available, and even end game scoring can swing it as well in terms of what you control at the end. So yeah, I would say that there's not incredibly tense moments as you play, because there is back and forth, but it still leads to quite a tight game overall.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And one other cautionary, while we're on the subject, one other cautionary measure for those of you who get a chance to try it out, don't use the variants in the rulebook. They're almost wholesale bad.
Yes. Score at the end of your turn.
Score at the end of your turn, and don't use the pre-programming thing. It's terrible.
Oh, yeah.
We tried that. It was just awful. I don't know why you'd bother. Or I don't know why we thought that might be an interesting idea. So bringing it back around, I mean, I guess the reason I threw the ball to you is because Ludus Magnus obviously is a company I've worked on, and I can't really talk about a lot of their games, or I don't want to. I choose not to because I was paid to cover them. But Dungeonology was an interesting one where you had sort of a bag building element, and the idea was it was a competitive game in which you were wizards going out into a sort of a dungeon or a wilderness, and there was a monster there, and you were going to study it with your students from Wizard University. And effectively, the students would go into a bag.
Harry Potter? Marvelous.
You're a wizard. But the students were effectively a currency that you'd use to pay to get research. So the idea was, I think, that you were largely sacrificing them.
Sounds like Dumbledore to me.
So it was a very novel concept, and it was very amusing, but we played the game twice, and we thought it was really pretty bad. And so I don't know, with those two examples, take them as a bit of hit and miss as a studio, I think.
Yeah, potentially, but I mean, if you're saying that was their earliest outing.
Well, I think it went Novateus Original, Black Rose Wars, and then Dungeonology, I think.
Gotcha.
Their offerings tend to be giant, miniature-loaded, sort of, big Kickstarters. And so if that's the sort of thing that you're into, or you like boss battlers, this might be something worth checking out.
Cool.
So I'll just keep pressing on with the news here. We've got Merchants of the Dark Road has got a new expansion coming out. This was surprising to me. I've got a copy of the game, which I backed from the original Kickstarter. It's an absolutely lavish production from Elf Creek Games, who you might know from Tidal Blades or Wonderland's War. I don't believe it's the same designers as those, but the company produced these sort of beautiful Kickstarters with incredibly deluxe versions and then much stripped back versions for retail. Merchants of the Dark Road, I saw, had very polarizing opinions amongst those that received it. I never actually got to play my copy. It just sort of fell under the radar and then got absorbed into the pile of opportunity, never to be revisited. So given how polarized the response to the game was, I'm surprised to see it's getting an expansion and a return to Kickstarter. You didn't get a chance to play it either, did you?
No, I've seen it, but I've never played it.
So I'm going to attempt to have a go at it before it returns to Kickstarter, and then I will talk about it in more detail in a future episode. All right. Seventh Citadel is a game that followed up Seventh Continent. It's been received by backers towards the back end of last year. People have been playing it. I believe it's been quite well received, although I've got a copy. I haven't had a chance to play it yet either, but it will be returning to Kickstarter in early June.
Yeah, like I remember Seventh... What's the first one? Continent?
Seventh Continent.
I regretted not backing it for all the duration of the campaign, and then I knew people that had it and they played it a few times, and we're just like, I just got to keep doing the same thing because I keep dying.
Yeah, I think I've had fun with it. I do think I think there's a couple of interesting notes about Seventh Continent, one of which is that the first curse that you get in the box is actually one of the longest.
Right.
So, like, if you have all the expansion stuff, it's actually better to start, I think, and don't quote me on this because, I'm no expert of Seventh Continent. I've played it about 7 or 8 times.
No, right.
And we've largely done different curses every time. I think I've played it 7 times, but I think I did play it an 8th time. But we
There's not
died
8 continents, so why would you?
Incredibly abruptly. Yeah, one for each continent, of course, obviously. Now, this is, of course, the 7th continent. It's not 7 continents. It's not trekking. But what's interesting is the sort of the expansion curses and things are actually shorter. They're much shorter. Like the first curse is 8+ hours, but the other curses go down to 2 or 3 hours and are much shorter affairs, I think. And obviously it's also going to be directly proportional to how many players you have. I wouldn't try it with more than 2. I haven't. I feel like, it disinclined to do that, but I've very much enjoyed my time with it too. And I do think it was odd how they sort of trotted out the curses. And also they didn't really put a good guide in the box on what you should start with.
Yeah. Or
even how long the curses take to complete. I think they do have some measure but it's short, medium, and long, and you're like, well, what does that even mean?
Yeah. If short's 3 hours, that's still a long game.
But there is also a chief complaint people have around the game, which is that, in Seventh Continent, it's a cooperative game in which you're exploring the Seventh Continent. It evokes survival games. It is largely a game of exploration and discovery. In the context of the game, you have been cursed, and you've arrived at the Seventh Continent to try and alleviate the curse. So you must explore the continent, discover the mystery of the curse and how to resolve it. And so it's a very narrative-driven game, but with a backdrop of sort of resource management to evoke survival, and hand and deck management as well to evoke physical fatigue, right? Wounds and thirst and hunger. And it is compelling. And as you go across the continent, you level up, you get to do some deck building, which affects your hands and your action selection. But it is also quite a long game. It's quite an involved game. People do find certain parts of it can be quite grindy if you get badly hurt. In order to heal yourself to a sort of a more functional state so you can progress, it can take some time. It involves backtracking across cards you might have already explored. And sometimes, if you're really dumb, you can get very abruptly killed.
Right.
And then it's just over. Unless, of course, you're like, I'll just go back to the last page and make a different choice, which is what I think most people do.
Keep your finger in the book. It's a classic.
Exactly right. But I've enjoyed my time with Seventh Continent, and I do find it reasonably compelling, and I enjoy the exploration. And because there is actually a geography that is consistent across all the curses, you can actually find areas that you've already explored on future plays and go, oh, I know this. I know where to find something good here. Yeah, exactly.
There's a way of getting better, but again, story games that live or die on the element of surprise is much better having something that's mechanically sound.
Yeah, and I do think that the fundamentals of Seventh Continent are reasonably compelling. I don't think it feels like a chore that's just propping up the narrative progression. Well, so this is about the Seventh Citadel, really, but I haven't had a chance to play it yet. So I'm excited to check out Seventh Citadel. You know, what they've done, I believe, is they've added sort of a sense of ongoing development to the game. So you're building up a city or a fort or something. It looks like the curses have been replaced with they're not called nemesis. Threats? I don't know. Some kind of big bad that you have to go out and defeat. So it's sort of still kind of campaigny, but none of them are as long as a full campaign, I don't think, of, say, you know, like a Gloomhaven or even a Sleeping Gods, which is much shorter.
Gotcha.
But that'll be coming back to Kickstarter on the 4th of June, and I shall attempt to stream some of it before it comes out so we can have a look at that in more detail, because I'm quite keen to play it.
Oh, cool.
So God of War is live on GameFound. This is a CMON implementation of the God of War video game. It ran for 10 days. When this podcast comes out, it will probably have ended about 10 days ago. And knowing CMON, you will be unable to pledge. So if you didn't pledge, too bad.
Yeah, no chance of getting it.
Yeah. Did you look at it?
No, in fact, I think I maybe saw it. But I recall the God of War card game. I presume it's not that.
No, it very much looks like a miniatures game. And it is cooperative, and you're playing as Kratos and his son.
Yeah, I forget his name. I don't have a PlayStation, so...
I wanted to say Arthas, and I was like, that's World of Warcraft. Yeah. Atreus? Atreus. Is it Atreus?
Camp Atreus? No.
Atreus?
Does he get drowned in the swamp? Atreus.
I don't know what you're referencing.
Never-ending story. The horse.
The horse. Yeah. So I looked at the rules for it a bit, and I was not particularly inspired. I can say positively that it wasn't another Zombicide, right. But it does seem kind of like a strange choice because, you know, the original God of War, which this is not based on, is very much a sort of hack and slashy kind of affair. And there was obviously a strong narrative element to that, but, you know, the narrative cinematics were few and far between, and most of it was hack and slash dungeon crawly stuff. The later games, which is what most people will be familiar with, i.e. God of War and God of War
Ragnarok,
that's right, God of War Ragnarok, which I haven't played either of, but people love. I believe they're a lot more cinematic and narratively driven than the originals.
You can watch, 4 hours of story on YouTube.
But I don't know, I didn't get a sense of any of that from the game. It looked like you just picked some characters to play as and then deployed some enemies. And I was not very inspired by what I saw on the GameFound page. It did not look particularly complex or compelling. I suspect that it is entirely for people who are big fans of the video games and don't really care about whether the game's any good.
Well, could be proven wrong.
I may well be proven wrong. I was deeply surprised by Bloodborne, the board game, which was also CMON.
Is that after Dark Souls? That was different. That was Steamforged, right? Yeah,
Dark Souls is Steamforged. Bloodborne was Cool Mini or Not. They're obviously all FromSoft games, but Bloodborne is a standalone title from FromSoft, although it is very reminiscent of Dark Souls, but with some key differences, which people who've played a lot more of those games can tell you about. I haven't played Bloodborne, so I can't tell you about the differences. I haven't played a whole lot of Dark Souls either.
I'm not a Soulsborne player.
So the Bloodborne board game was a surprise hit with me, and you can see our live streams of that up on the show. So maybe God of War will be another surprising one, but notably, Eric Lang was quite involved in the development of Bloodborne and God of War. He has long since left the company. So anyway, that's that. I will not be back in God of War. But if you did, leave a comment on the YouTubes. Let us know how you got on with it in 18 months when it arrives.
Yeah, exactly.
And on the topic of Cool Mini or Not, they've also launched the Dread Keep. Now, this is not a campaign. It is actually a pre-order on GameFound. So you can just go ahead and pre-order this when they open up the pre-orders for it. I had a look at it. It is Zombicide. And you're a big fan of Zombicide.
That's no longer the case.
But you could get new Zombicide, Barry.
I could, and I believe it's changed through the iterations, but I mean, there was too much of it in the first place, and there's only more now. I think it's fine as a couple hours, but then more and more of it was slightly like the campaign and the story modes, and it's just like it's not that deep.
It's a little bit lopsided, isn't it? For the complexity and compellingness of the mechanisms do not have the stamina to carry the volume of content.
Yes, that would be relatively fair. And they have put things in, and the equipment, cards, and whatever else, even going back to first edition type of stuff. And so I think they've refined the formula as things go. They've Marvel Zombies and now Deceased. But I've not picked up again since Green Horde, or whatever the first medieval one was.
Oh, well, that was Black Plague.
Black Plague, yeah. So I've literally not played it since like season 3 of the original. So it's not even second edition Zombicide. So I can't really judge.
Yeah, I couldn't dive into the subtle differences between, say, the Dreadkeep. Dreadkeep? I think it's Dreadkeep. Yeah, I'll just call it the Dreadkeep throughout this whole section, but it is in fact the Dead Keep. Between the Dreadkeep and other iterations of Zombicide, one thing I can comment on is that the Dreadkeep has art by Paul Bonner, who also did the art for Trudvang Legends, which was a campaign bag builder from Simon, and I really like that art. I think it's gorgeous. I think Paul Bonner is great. I would almost back the Dreadkeep just to have his art all over the game. But I think, it is still fundamentally Zombicide. It's all the same designers. And so if that's not a system you're interested in, then this will probably not be for you. But if you are interested in it, or maybe a new version of it, some long descended ancestor of it, go and have a look at Dreadkeep. It is a pre-order on GameFound. I don't know how long it will be available, but presumably longer than a campaign?
Well, pledge managers are open for months these days.
Simon are not good at pledge managers. Like, their pledge managers open for like 5 minutes, and often people who back the campaign miss it. Yeah. The Simon pledge managers are generally pretty rough, I have found in my experience. 2 more headlines for me, and then we'll get to the news with Barry, games he's excited about. I've got an unannounced Star Trek project is being designed by David Turczi. I think a lot of people have heard this already, so it's probably just a little bit of news in case you missed it.
What is this, the old news segment? Oh.
Way. But we don't know anything about it. There's nothing we're allowed to say, so we will follow that up in due course.
How could you say something if you don't know anything about it? Oh.
Well, all we know is that he's working on it, or he's working on a project with the license. And even if we did know more, we wouldn't be allowed to say it, because that's all that's been officially announced. But I like Star Trek. I really like Star Trek. Do you like Star Trek?
I like Star Trek. Well, depends. Some of the new Trek, not so much. But
yeah, I like Star Trek up until the end of the 90s.
Well, that's not even true. Strange New Worlds, I think, is still good.
I haven't seen it.
No, if you like 90s Trek, you should like Strange New Worlds.
Fair enough. Actually, and just to very quickly follow up, Gale Force 9 have also announced they'll be doing a big box of Star Trek Ascendancy later this year with all of the stuff in it. So if you've ever thought about picking up an entire Star Trek Ascendancy collection, there will be a campaign on GameFound, I think, later this year for everything Ascendancy.
Nice.
And if you want to see a very funny game of Star Trek Ascendancy on the channel, you can go and check out our series, which I did with Ben, and it is amusing and funny because we totally forgot about warp. We didn't warp the whole game.
Slowly moseying around.
Last bit of news, this actually has just come out end of April, and this is going to tie in with something we're going to talk about a bit later in the played section, but Chip Theory Games and Neon Knight Games have partnered up for an ongoing partnership. You will know Chip Theory Games from their titles, which are big, fancy, overproduced. Well, that's a subjective thing, but big, fancy and expensively produced games, Hoplomachus reissued or remastered, as it should be called.
Hoplomachus 3, more hopping.
More hopping, yeah. And less stabbing or more stabbing? Who knows? We've got also from them, though, Too Many Bones and Burn Cycle and the forthcoming Elder Scrolls, the board game. And they're lighter titles as well. They've got 20 Strong and I want to call it Lock Key, but I don't.
Yeah, that was like it's much smaller than other games, right?
Oh yeah, that one and 20 Strong are tiny little things.
Yeah, but 20 Strong I did consider backing. It looks fun enough in the one deck dungeon kind of way.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to play 20 Strong, so I don't know. I didn't back it. I did back Hoplomachus, which I played on. I played Hoplomachus Victorum, which is the solo version on the show. We played through the whole campaign. I played Hoplomachus Remastered in my personal time. It's a skirmish head-to-head version. Hoplomachus, if you don't know, is sort of fantastical medieval Sparta. Sparta, or Greek or Roman gods, I think. It's gladiatorial battles. And you, in the gladiatorial battles, you have figures running around the arena and punching each other to death, or stabbing, or whatever they're doing.
Whatever you can get away with, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's uber violence. And it's a lot of dice resolved skirmish conflict with a lot of keywords giving units different unique powers. I thought overall they were perfectly fine amusements with incredible production value, but fundamentally they were kind of undermined by the dice rolly combat resolution. It's very swingy, and it doesn't feel like there's quite enough design space to make the skirmish combat feel to make the factions feel distinct enough from one another. And also, at some point, they decided that combat at the end of the day must be determined purely with a single dice roll, and there's no actions you can take in the game to affect the dice roll. Like, the actions are all about moving people around and changing their positioning in the arena, which feels like an interesting choice in that I don't think they gave themselves enough design space. And so I actually haven't got around to selling my Hoplomachus collection, but I will be. Burn Cycle is a solo-only game. Well, no, it's not. It's cooperative, but you can play solo. And it is a robots in the future sort of puzzle where the robots are going into these warehouses and trying to overthrow their human overlords by rebelling against their programming. It's sort of an interesting action selection game, but the puzzles are sort of Lego puzzles. Like, you'll pick a mission and you'll pick an adversary and a sort of a layout to the map. And I found that the puzzles, it was difficult to create a consistently compelling experience, given how many options there were and how different they were, and how different how the robots made different sort of elements. I just found myself thinking, like, I'd rather play different solo experiences or even cooperative experiences. Like, I could be playing Spirit Island, for example.
Yeah.
So I give up on Burn Cycle. But you can find my live streams of that on the channel and my review of that on the channel. So anyway, I am very excited for Elder Scrolls, though. I do love Elder Scrolls. And Too Many Bones. I love Too Many Bones. So
finally, you can play Skyrim on a piece of paper. It's on everything else.
Well, it's very consciously. You can tell from the campaign. It's very consciously, and Skyrim everywhere. You know, Skyrim on everything. Play Skyrim on a potato. Yeah, we can play it on your Alexa. But this was very consciously not Skyrim. It was Elder Scrolls. What's the realm of Elder Scrolls called? I don't know.
Tamriel spring to mind, but I don't know if that is.
Sounds right. Tamriel. Anyway, I really liked Morrowind and Oblivion and Daggerfall, so I was quite keen to get Elder Scrolls, the board game. And Chip Theory Games, in my mind, have got this one really good game, Too Many Bones, that I would be keen to see a sort of follow-up reiteration of, with some differences set in a setting I really like. I don't see it replacing Too Many Bones. I really like Too Many Bones, but they have obviously decided that they need more light games and affordable games in their oeuvre. So they have gone out and partnered with Neon Night Games, which is a studio who don't have any games.
All right. Sign me up.
Neon Night Games was set up by Manny Tremblay, a game designer who you may know as the co-designer of Dice Throne.
Certainly played Dice Throne.
And so he has launched the first Kickstarter for Neon Night Games, a game called Neon Rain, which looks to be some kind of fighting game. It's live on Kickstarter. It will be about 5 or 6 days left when this comes out. So yeah, it's very much got this sort of like 80s neon aesthetic. And in a minute, when we get to the played, I will also be talking about Wroth, which is a game that Chip Theory Games put out. It was on GameFound a little while ago. And now when this episode comes out, you can late pledge to it. That went live actually on the day we recorded this, the late pledge. So you can go check that out if you want, but I'll talk more about that later. So they've obviously enjoyed working and collaborating with Manny Tremblay, and they've said, come and do more games for us. And he said, well, I've just started my own company. And they said, well, we'll buy it.
Yeah.
I think that's all conjecture. I don't know if that's actually how it worked out, but it certainly seems to be the way. So we'll see more collaborations between them. And now I pass the baton to Barry to tell you about a couple of games he's excited for.
Yeah, very kind. So yeah, just a couple of upcoming or imminent games that have caught my eye. Firstly, I'd just like to point out I'm trying not to buy any new games unless they blow me away. So while there's lots of things that look good, I am trying to temper my excitement for just everything new that comes out. But the first one I'm going to talk about was a Gest of Robin Hood. So that's Golf Echo Sierra Tango, meaning an adventure or a tale of an adventure. So a Gest of Robin Hood, of Robin Hood, published by GMT Games and designed by Fred Serval, is based on the coin system. So coin being counterinsurgency. And this is like a series of games GMT do with a military or political group taking actions against guerrillas. That's G-U-E-R, not G-O-R, or revolutionaries, or the rebellion, or things along those lines. And so in this case, it's the Sheriff of Nottingham against Robin Hood. So the game initially just looks quite nice. It's got that sort of old tapestry, old English kind of look to a lot of the cards, and a lot of the art's very nice. But the pieces themselves, the sort of foil stamped on a lot of the wooden pieces, and looks especially nice for a GMT game, which historically, unintended, have looked little more than functional. That is changing though. They do have a lot of nicer looking games these days. And in the game, there seems to just be a lot you can do. A bit of bluffing. You could have a bit of aggro, harrying the sheriff, or trying to hunt down Robin Hood. It's only a 2.6 out of 5 weight on Board Game Geeks, and it does look sort of straightforward enough that you can bust it out and play. You don't have to learn all the cards like you might have to do in Twilight Struggle or something like that. And I think it's out effectively next month, so sometime in June. But that said, I've still not finished the whole game of the Plum Island Horror, which is also GMT Games, although they're sort of more State of Emergency series. So I'm not in a rush for it, but I did catch my eye, and I'm hoping somebody I know might buy it. I don't know if you've seen any of...
Well, full disclosure, Fred Serval is a personal friend of mine. I've known him for years. And I didn't say that because I was really interested to hear what you were going to say about this.
It looks terrible. It's the worst game I've ever seen.
Yeah, quick, too much bias. Oh no. Backtrack. But Fred, this is his second published design. His first was Red Flag Over Paris, which is the fight over the Paris Commune, something I wasn't really aware of, and I'm still not particularly well educated on. Sorry, Fred. But this was about stamping out communism as it came up in this part of Paris. And his design ethos for both that and for Gest is about creating war games. Fred is a historical war gamer, very much embedded in that kind of thing. And that are that present the sort of typical mechanics you would find in these sorts of games, but in a way that is much more accessible and a good introduction to this sort of side of the hobby, especially for people that may be unfamiliar with it. So Red Flag Over Paris is very much a head-to-head war game with card play. It's sort of evocative of a Twilight struggle, but on a much smaller scale. And and again, full disclosure, I know Fred personally. He gave me a review copy of Red Flag. So, I make of this what you will, but I really like Red Flag Over Paris. I think it really does what Fred set out to do, which is to introduce people to these sorts of games and these mechanisms. I'm happy to keep it in my collection. It's actually on my shelf of games. That is the shelf for games I would pull out whenever the sort of opportunity arises. And so Gest is the sort of a similar sort of approach, but for the coin system, which is counterinsurgency games, which are typically very heavy and very asymmetrical. And Gest is looking to make that a little bit more accessible for people who don't know the coin series and don't really know where to start, which is, I think, much needed actually, because when you think about
some of them are heavy.
They're pretty much all heavy. People ask, where should I start? And it's like, realistically, they're all a lot of work. So probably don't start with Gandhi. And after that, pick a historical setting that you like.
Yep. Or something you want to know more about. Educational as well.
So yeah, I'm very keen to give that a try as well. I'm keen to play that. And I'm really pleased for Fred as well.
As I said, it should be out sometime in June. The other game that was kind of came on my radar over the last week or so is Keyframes. So Keyframes is published by Combo Games and being created by Oft co-designers Idra C and Shy S, who made The Red Cathedral and White Castle, both of them published by Devere. So Keyframes looks like a pretty light turn-bidding set collection game where you're trying to get a job as a keyframe animator at a studio, and you have to get the right cards and the right sequence for your projects. Looks to play in about 15 minutes, so more of a filler than an event game, but can't go too wrong in at least trying it out. But there's not a lot of details out there yet. It was more just the designers that kind of interested me. And it's a quite a unique theme.
Yeah, I mean, Red Cathedral and White Castle are both games I've talked a bit about in the past, but I've enjoyed both of those games. I do think one of their key selling points is the amount of game you get in the little box. I don't know if this is still in that kind of oeuvre, if it's a bigger box or... No,
that is small. I think it's mostly just card driven. There's not a lot in the way of images or information yet. I'm not sure when that's coming out.
Well, there you go. So 2 games to keep your eyes out for.
So what else have you been playing then, Mike?
A seamless segue into the what we've been playing since we last recorded section. And I've tried to keep this largely to stuff that is sort of new or exciting or interesting. So I've had to take some stuff off the list. I've been playing a lot of games.
Some really dull games with some really dull people.
No, just some classic games. So like, the honourable mentions are Study in Emerald 2nd Edition, which I really enjoy. I had a really good game of that.
Over 1st Edition?
I haven't played 1st Edition.
Very different games.
I mean, I heard the main difference, and this is just for you people who know the games, but I've heard, because I'm not going to go into the rules, this is already going over long, but I've heard the main difference is that so it's sort of an auction game with hidden teams, and to an extent it's a deck builder auction game with hidden teams where you're bidding on cards round to round. And one of the big elements is that you can't buy a card until you've sort of put your resources down on it. And then the game comes back around to you, at which point, if you're still winning the auction, i.e. you have the most pieces on the card, you may then purchase it. And so this idea is that people are trying to infer what team you're on based on on what cards you're buying, and that the idea is it's not a team game, so you still only have one winner, but it's useful to know who's on your team, because if the player who ends up in last position is on your team, everyone on your team gets -5 points. So you're somewhat incentivized to help the people on your team But first you must work out who they are. And nobody wants to reveal what team they're on because you're also competing with everyone else. It's a really interesting, quite unique dynamic that is not, that I've not seen in many other games. It's quite difficult for people to grok. And I also think there is some people have observed that it can be quite hard to help your teammates. And of course, you very rarely know for sure who they are anyway. Although that'll depend a lot on the players at the table and their capacity for poker face. But the second edition makes the purchasing of cards a lot easier. So you're not easier, accessing the cards easier. So you're a lot more focused on who's buying what cards and why. In the first edition, traveling between the locations is a lot harder, which means that you have less options in terms of what cards you're pursuing for this auction mechanism. And so there's a little bit more logistics going on, and maybe the capacity for sort of bluffing and double bluffing by buying cards that might be good for the other team is reduced, I guess, and people are sort of railroaded into card buys a bit more by the mechanisms of the game. But I haven't played the first edition, but some people swear by it. I find the second edition really pleasant. There is, of course, they're both horribly out of print, but there is, of course, a reprint coming, which will not contain the Sherlock Holmes element of the game, I don't think, because the rights to the Study in Emerald is not being given to the game, but it will contain all the Cthulhu stuff. So Study in Emerald, of course, a short story by Neil Gaiman, in which Sherlock Holmes is investigating a cosmic elder god from the H.P. Lovecraft mythos. And the new version is Cthulhu Dark Providence. And that is a reimplementation of Study in Emerald by Cool Mini or Not. And it was a pre-order, and now the pre-orders are done, I think, and you'll just have to wait for it to show up at retail.
I seen that played. I didn't think it was the same game.
Yeah, it's supposed to be much closer to first edition Study in Emerald than second edition. So that was an honorable mention. I also played Brass Birmingham, which remains really, really good. Yeah, well, I mean, does anyone need me to explain Brass Birmingham?
If you're listening to this podcast, you probably know what Brass Birmingham is.
Yeah, and if you don't know anything about Brass Birmingham, it's the #1 game. It's best at 4, and I'm sure you can find people to show it to you. We also played it on the show. We played it a little bit incorrectly on the show, but it still gives a very good flavor of how the game works. Whoopsie, yeah, well, we got that back when it first came out, and we played the game so that you only play 1 card per turn from your hand instead of 2.
Right. Yeah.
But interestingly, it actually didn't change the game a whole lot.
Everybody had the same rules, I guess. Just slows you down.
Yeah, and it just meant that people were sort of less able to jump into sort of selling things and buying things and building things. So you sort of, the timing restrictions were possibly even more demanding. But no, it's a great game. I'd happily play Brass Birmingham anytime, and Brass Lancashire for that matter, and also Age of Industry, even though it looks like ass compared to the Roxley editions. But moving on, I have played Wroth. So Wroth is a new game from Chip Theory Games. It was on GameFound. The late pledge is now open. It is designed by Manny Tremblay from Dice Throne fame. He's also the artist on Wroth. He did all the art for it. And I played a prototype copy that had been given to a content creator, which they had used to make content, and they showed it to me and played it with me. We played a 3-player game. And I've got some theme text here for you, Barry. Are you ready for theme?
I'm excited to hear it.
The Drudgian Peninsula has known only war for centuries. Factions marshal their troops to battle to control the peninsula's plateaus. Masses of foot soldiers and spear carriers cross plains and waves to fight. They travel alongside their chiefs, officers, seers, masters, and lords, as varied as their cultures and homelands. Why this age-old conflict? We need a premise for the game.
Yeah.
And so it is a generic fantasy setting in which generic fantasy races with some asymmetry are fighting for some long forgotten reason.
You said it was Chip Theory, right? It's not like Cloudspire, or they're not trying to build out one of their or
It's not set in any of their existing universes, which does seem kind of like a missed opportunity, honestly.
Yeah.
But I don't know why that is the case. But I suppose, I've put here in the notes, is suggestion sometimes better than detail? And I wonder, like, the game possibly doesn't need much more theme than it's got. It's quite an abstract game, and we'll get to that a bit later on. Having said that, generic fantasy is also a little bit helpful with sort of accessing how the different factions might play.
Right, you can draw upon your real-world knowledge of fantasy.
Exactly. If it was much weirder, then you might find it less intuitive. So the player count is 1 to 4. There's a solo mode. There were some expansions, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't go above 4 players. There's a 1 board only, and that's for 4 players or less. It's a competitive game. There's also a solo and a cooperative mode, which allows, they're the same mode. It's just solos on your own, and cooperative is up to 4 again, where you play against an AI enemy. But in the competitive mode, it is about area majority, and it's all targeted player interactions. So it's very, very aggressive. You win by getting 30 points, which come from holding territories. There's no end-game scoring. I think it's you can go over 30 because you score the final round, and then if anyone's over 30, it's over, and some people might be both over 30 in contention still. It is definitely a solid middleweight game. It is designed to be fast and quick. It's designed to be about 60 minutes. But it's got asymmetry in it. It's got some more advanced hobby concepts. So I wouldn't say like it's lightweight in terms of being more accessible for, say, new gamers or novice gamers, but it is lightweight certainly in terms of its speed and its downtime and its length. So all good things, really, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Like something that can play 4 players with enough depth that's interesting in 60 minutes is comparatively rare in terms of what you get these days in board games.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've written here that it takes about 60 to 90 minutes to play. I reckon, we played it at 3. None of us had played before. Well, one of us had played before, but only solo. But we played at 3, and we were done in like less than 60 minutes. And I can't remember if that included the teach or not. I don't think so. But, overall, I think we taught it, learned it, played it in under 90 minutes and set it up as well. So, it really does honor its claim to be fast. It's 15 to 20 minutes to teach. It's really very simple to teach if you're teaching it to a hobby gamer crowd. If you're not, there's some advanced concepts, asymmetry, action selection type stuff that might be a little bit more alien to people, and that might take a little bit longer. It certainly relies on familiarity with hobby concepts. At its core, it's a dice drafting game, and you will roll a pool of dice every round, and then everyone will take turns drafting the dice, which have actions on, and you'll also have a fate die, which is your own personal die that you'll just roll and have. And so you've got 3 dice, and each die is an action. You can also trade 2 dice for 1 other action. So you're doing 2 to 3 actions per round, and then it's over. It's an area majority game where the board is very reminiscent of Kemet or Cthulhu Wars. So it's sort of like every territory is sort of 2 or 3 moves away from every other territory. There's sort of deployment zones where you'll put troops out, and then they can access the rest of the board quite easily. There's going to be, at the end of each round, points awarded for holding territories, and you'll get extra points if you dominate the territory. That means you're ahead by a certain amount. I've put down here that there's troop management, and what I mean by that is you actually have a fixed number of soldiers that you can access over the course of the game. So you recruit them onto the board, and then they start moving around. But when they die, they don't go back to that supply. They go out of the game. So it's possible if you get murdered a lot, you'll just run out of troops and be eliminated. It didn't
player
seem
elimination.
possible.
That sounds terrible.
Well, I don't think it's very likely to happen. And by the time it did happen, the game's probably only got at most 10 minutes left.
Yeah.
But it sort of affects people's like mentality in an interesting way, because suddenly these troops are like way more precious than if they go back to your supply,
Yeah.
And I can't think of a troops on a map game where killed troops just go out of the game.
I'm sure there are some, but yeah, nothing immediately springs to mind. But that's it's another resource, right? It's just a way to look at them. Your troops are a resource; they're finite. You want to be winning using your troops as best you can if you can win with no troops on the board, that's arguably an excellent play, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. It's just it's sort of a more savage resource because they're out the game.
They're not real people.
No, but I mean, it's like all other resources in games, they go back to the general supply and then you can just get them back again. But these ones are gone. They're back in the game box and you can't take them out. There is some resource management in the game. There are these crystals called Cora that you can use to buy your faction-specific troops, which take the form of dice. You'll never roll them. They actually just represent hit points. So they have a fixed number of hit points, and when they go onto the board, they take damage, the dice tick down, and when they're dead, they go out of the game, Barry. They're gone.
Diminishing resources.
And then everyone's got a card, which is a single-use faction power on it, that you can trigger once per game, and all of them are powerful and broken.
After you've used it, does it go back in the box?
Can do. It's done. It can't be replayed.
Diminishing resources.
I've written here that there's barbarians, which are bear guys. Barbarians with a bear motif. We've got some elves. There are some orcs, who are albino orcs. You've got a guild. They're called the Guild. They're sneaky rogues. There's some dwarves. That's the core box. And then if you get the expansions, there's some paladins and some tree people.
All right. Okay. So expansions add different factions with different powers.
Yep, that's it. Each expansion is just a new faction.
Could be good. Yeah, the way you described it sounds pretty good. I'll give it a go.
Well, I played it with 3, and I was the paladins, and I was playing against the tree people and the guild. The tree people had played before, but the guild player came out the gate really strong. They have a power that sort of allows them to amass a lot of money, and I think that player was hoping to use it to actually pull the economy out of the game. So they'd play it, they'd grab a bunch of money, and then just not spend it. It wouldn't go back into the game, and just like the rest. I mean, the money doesn't go back in the game box. It goes back to a general supply when you spend it. But if there is no money, and by money I mean the crystals called Cora, it can't. There, you just can't get it, right? So it's sort of they'd hold on to it and starve us of those resources. But in the end, they wound up spending all of those to sort of come swinging out the gate with a bunch of unique units, taking a very strong early lead, and then the rest of us beat that player down for the rest of the game.
You don't want to be the target. Not in a 3-player game.
And that's sort of what I'm going to come back around to, because the tree folk player was very much trying to take territories that the guild player controlled, and then I used my faction power about 2/3 of the way through the game to get a very good board presence, and the first player had been sort of dragged down by the tree folk player, and so in the end the tree folk player played something of a kingmaker-ish role, although I don't know if tactically there was great positioning for that player on my side of the board. Insofar as there is a side of the board, like I said, there's not a huge amount of geography. It did feel kind of like a kingmaker-ish. So I'll come back to that when I get to my conclusions here. But I just want to say, it really reminded me actually of Inish, but faster, just much faster. It's got dice drafting. Inish has card drafting. The card drafting is a lot more involved. In this, there's far fewer dice. Far fewer actions. There's no big card text or anything like that. But it's also got the targeted player interaction, and the win conditions aren't binary. Like in Inish, everyone's competing to reach these thresholds in sort of 3 or 4 different categories. And the minute someone hits that threshold, they win the game. In this, it's a race to 30, so you can't sort of undo that. All you can do is try and take territories away from the person who's ahead, so they amass victory points slower. I mean, you could theoretically kill all their troops so they grind to a complete halt, but it doesn't seem likely.
Unlikely.
I've also written here it's evocative of Rising Sun and Ankh. I guess that is because it's troops on the map, and it's a bit argy-bargy, and it's got some asymmetry in it. The theme, of course, is this generic fantasy. The asymmetry of the areas really, I think, helps to deliver the idea that you're playing different factions. But the game is very abstract, insofar as abstract means it's not a narrative-driven game, and it's quite strategic with low luck. The biggest luck element in the game really is the fate die, which each player has and gets to roll each round, and that can do anything from allowing you to initiate another conflict or to gain some extra resource or something like that. There's no real planning for that. But initiating a conflict. So it's much like Cthulhu Wars or Blood Rage. You can coexist in a region without triggering a conflict, and that must be triggered subsequently at the right moment. And it is theoretically possible that and all the dice come up with no conflicts on them, and you could have an entire round with only one conflict, because you can always trade in 2 dice for an action. But when you trade in 2 dice for an action, there's like a menu, and when you take the action, it's done. So the next person can't do the same thing. I think, and again, this was a prototype, so this may well be different from the final copy. There's going to be very limited conflict that round. So the actual actions available and what might happen round to round, you have to be very sort of tactical and react to what's available, rather than sort of having a long-term strategy that you're fixated on, because it may not be possible based on what's coming up. But it is entirely open information. There's no hidden information. And so it does still feel quite sort of abstract and deterministic. And the combat is extremely deterministic. You don't roll any dice to resolve that. It's just, I do X amount of damage points to you. I'm going to kill these units, or I'm going to kill that one big unit. And as I said, the big units, your unique faction units, they all have special powers and a number of hit points. And so when they're dealt damage, those hit points just tick down. So even if you don't kill them outright, they just carry that damage for the rest of their lives. I do think like I was saying, the generic fantasy helps to bring across the flavors of the factions. And I think give it a bit more, make it feel less like an abstract game and more like sort of warring armies. When I was writing my notes for this, I actually looked up, were there any 3-sided battles in history?
I imagine there have been, yeah.
No, not really. It turns out that when people go to war, most generals are like, oh, we'll let them kill each other and then invade at the end.
Swoop in.
So I guess it's more like sort of abstractly mimicking many small skirmishes rather than one big battle, you know? Yeah. And as I said, like when you do a conflict in a region, you just fight one other player anyway. So you pick someone to sort of boot out that region. So there's a lot of targeted player interaction, very aggressive. And the game is very bright neon. Like it doesn't look like generic fantasy. So Manny Tremblay also does all of his own art. He did almost all the art for Dice Throne. I think he might have done all of it. I can't say if he did everything in, say, Dice Throne Adventures or something like that, but he does all of his own art, and he's done all the art for this. And I do think it's quite polarizing. Like I've heard some people say they really don't like it. I really like it. I think his art's really cool. It's sort of cartoony. It's a lot of fun. And I really like the sort of neon look of this game. It looks really unrealistic, but it's really bright and it's really visually luxurious, like appealing. I liked it. I really liked it.
Their stylistics better than realistic in many ways, right? As long as it's consistent.
Exactly. So there's not really like a big novelty to the game. There's nothing it's sort of doing that's going to grab you and make you go like, oh, that's new and weird and interesting, or, you know, unique, or, you know, a piece of production that I haven't seen before. And it's obviously very evocative of Troops on a Map games. It's super quick to play. It doesn't really have an answer for kingmaking as a problem, other than it's really short. You know, Ankh obviously going out there with the merge mechanic to try and a new novel way to resolve kingmaking or change the dynamic of the game. I love it. Obviously, some people really polarized by that. Ankh didn't like it at all. But, you know, you still see stuff like in Blood Rage where certain strategies beeline people into becoming kingmakers. And so I do think it's nice when a game of this ilk attempts to have an answer for that or do something new or weird or interesting to upset that dynamic. Here, it doesn't really. And I do think that based on how the game unfolds over the course of the 60 minutes, you could get into some kingmakery situations. If it's a really tight game, it might not unfold that way. Obviously, we had a dynamic where the guild player came out really, really strong and amassed a lot of points. And then it was sort of up to me to ally with the other player to bring them back. And then because I just had better opportunities or came on stronger later in the game, with my strategy, I was able to take that second place, and then the third player ended up king-making me to an extent. But I also don't think they had much strategic choice. They had to pick on the leader, and then they couldn't really pivot dynamically to attack me after that. Although they probably could have taken decisions earlier in the game that would have given them more strategic horizons later to potentially balance things out a bit more. Overall, I didn't think the game had like any major issues in terms of sort of accessibility or production or anything like that. I mean, chip theory games do major production value in their games. Yep. And this was, even this prototype was gorgeous. I expect the final project will be gorgeous. I think that if you like these sort of confrontational war games, if you're looking for something fast and punchy that you can teach really quickly, potentially even play a couple of times back to back, I think this really fits into that niche. I would absolutely play it again. I ended up backing it after I played it, and I'm excited to get my copy and play it some more. The base game was like not very expensive. It was $55 US for the base game, plus another $10 for shipping to the UK. So that's, I think, $65 for a chip theory game is really reasonable.
How many chips were there?
Well, that was really funny. That was a point of joke throughout. They do actually, so their chip theory games are known for their big poker chips, right? And stacks of poker chips. Both in Hoplomachus and in Too Many Bones, the poker chips are the unit's health. So you put a big stack of health chips under the top chip, and that's sort of their signature component. In this, there's not really any scope for chips. So what they've got are what they call mini chips, which are basically just tokens that they've turned into poker chips. And what they are is they randomize the victory point values of the regions during setup. And then they just sit there on the table as a face-up victory point token.
One way to get it in, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. They found a way to get the chips in, is what I'm saying. But yeah, I mean, I think, and in terms of, like replayability and that sort of thing, I think it's got some mileage because of the player interaction. I think games with more player interaction tend to have more replayability because people are always surprising, even if the game becomes quite familiar. And there's not any discovery. There's no event cards. The board is never going to change. The setup will change because those chips will go to different regions, but I don't think that's going to be like massively dramatically interesting. So I think most of the replayability comes from who you've got at the table and the factions you use, right? So there's 5 in the box. So I put that into a calculator. I worked out that I think if you're playing with 3 factions per game, so 3 players, and you've just got the core set, there's 10 different combinations of factions you can use. And that gets exponentially bigger if you buy the expansions, and also lower if you have 4 players. But then that'll feel different anyway. So overall, I recommend this one if you like those sort of argy-bargy games. If you like Inish, but you're like, this gets a bit too long. Yeah, so that's Wroth. I'm excited to get my copy.
Very nice. Well, I've actually been a little bit light on games in April. Been engaging with the hobby in other ways. But what I have played a reasonable amount of this month was Lorcana, as the tournament season was upon us. So Lorcana, published by Ravensburger, designed by Ryan Miller and Steve Warner. It's primarily a head-to-head card game featuring many different Disney characters. So much like in Magic the Gathering, players take the role of a planeswalker slinging spells at each other. In Lorcana, you are an Illumineer, bringing these characters to life, either in ways that you know from the story or what-if type characters, where that character, whether they were good or evil, got their wish. Like, what would they be like if they got their wish that they had during the film? And the game's played out where both players are competing to earn 20 lore by questing with characters. Your characters have like a cost, attack stat, a health stat, and a questing stat to get you towards this 20 number. But when you quest, it makes them vulnerable to challenges from the other character. And so it's a risk always whenever you put them, exhaust them to use them to gain lore. Instead of playing cards, players can choose to put cards into their their ink to play more expensive cards, but always at the cost, of course, of not being able to play the card that you've just inked. And with it being Disney, characters can sing songs for special effects on cards, and that's where a lot of the variety comes into the game. Every character's got abilities as well, but being able to do these different actions make it kind of interesting. Unlike other card games, like either Magic the Gathering, which I mentioned, or potentially many other card games that you've played, there's no interaction on the other player's turn. Right? So that makes it, this isn't a game of sudden twists and turns, but you will usually have a chance to answer an opponent's card before they can do too much with it. Now, it is on the lighter side of these sort of collectible card games and these trading card games, but that seems to be kind of where the market's heading. One Piece and the revamped Dragon Ball Fusion, they're much easier, much like Pokemon. These sort of lighter games are kind of where things are going or are at the moment, at least. But yeah, so I played a lot to get ready for sort of tournament season. I had to scramble to get all the cards I needed. I've only been playing for a couple of months since the last set came out. Didn't quite manage to get every card I needed, but the one that I didn't have wouldn't have made any difference. Went out to a practice tournament out in Aldershot, just to get in a bit of a play against other people. And then I went to the championship at Dark Sphere here in London, which had 29 players, and I ended up coming third, winning one of the promo cards by the top 4, which was nice.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you. Children's card game. It's a children's card game. There was only 30 years plus men there. But yeah, it's a children's card game. There was some people, but there wasn't a lot of children as such. There was some variety in who was out and about. So the only games I lost in Swiss was, in fact, I lost to the same person in Swiss and the semi-finals. A fella named Lorcana Villain on YouTube, if you're wanting some Lorcana content. Nice guy, but I think he knew he kind of had our matchups in the bag. Like, I didn't have a good game against his deck in particular, and he plays a lot, and he knew the sort of matchups inside out. But the new set's out this month, May, again, and now that introduces co-op play, so I'm definitely going to check that out and play potentially a bit more. So obviously card games are my jam, and I'll play any card game that's going, so a lot of Lorcana getting played. Do you have a chance to play it yet?
No, it's not something that I mean, these sort of lifestyle deck construction games are really hard for me to get into, particularly because I'm not a big fan of deck construction.
And also because it's a collectible game as well, it's silly expensive at times to get the card you want. Yeah.
The only one that I own and possess and play is Netrunner, the Null Signal version.
What else have you been playing?
All right, so this next one actually I've left in partly because I feel like I should have talked about it and I haven't. Everything else on this list is either brand new or on crowdfunding or has just been crowdfunded. This is an older title. We played it on the show 3 years ago when it was on Kickstarter. It was a long time ago, this one. But this is Carnegie, which is designed by Xavier Georges, who did Carson City and Ginkopolis. It's art by Ian O'Toole and published by Quint Games. And I backed this on Kickstarter after playing it on BGA.
Me too.
And amazing. So, in this game, you are an unnamed entrepreneur in the US in the mid-19th century, and you are mimicking the story of Andrew Carnegie, building up companies and industry in the US and engaging in philanthropic endeavors. The game plays 1 to 4, although I haven't played it solo. It does have a solo mode, and it is a competitive heavy Euro. The game is played for 20 rounds, And then you earn points during the game and also at the end of the game with, I've put here probably about a 40-60 split, but I think that's actually not quite right. I think it's probably more like 20-80. So earning about 20% of your points during the game and 80% at endgame scoring. The game has asymmetrical endgame scoring, which will be established during the game and could be quite lopsided if you're not careful. It's a heavy Euro. It feels like it feels actually, I think, less heavy than it is. You know, it once you start playing, I think it flows really well, and it can be really clip and fast. But I actually think it is quite heavy, and there's some really sort of really strong hobby concepts in there. I think it takes about 2 to 3 hours to play, and the teach is probably about 30 minutes, possibly a bit longer, especially if people are relatively new to the hobby. Relatively new to heavy hobby games. So there's a board of America in the center of the table, which represents the states waiting for you to come and develop companies and industry in them. You've got a player board that represents your company, which is going to be engaging in and doing these things. And then you've got this little board, which is action selection. And the way this works, it's sort of different and unique to this game, but it's 4 rows of regions on the board, and each row is one of the 4 actions that exists in the game. So on your turn, you'll pick one action to do and move it along to the next space on the row, which will trigger an income for that region on the board. So you're sort of picking an action, picking an income, and then everybody's going to resolve that stuff in turn order. So there is a really strong logistics mechanism in the game, which is also quite novel. It's the player board that you possess has 2 major components to it. One is R&D, where you're going to be exploring different industries you can build across America, and eventually you'll run out of buildings you can build. So you'll have to use R&D points to extend these boards out the side of your player board to get more discs. But that's one of the more advanced, not advanced necessarily.
You have to do it, yeah.
Yeah, you have to do it. It's definitely fundamental to the game. But even more fundamental is the positioning of your workers throughout your company. And that's the main bulk of your player board. So you've got all these little rooms that start off empty with a few basic exceptions. And then you start off with a workforce that are all these little meeples that hang out in your company, and you're going to distribute them across these spaces on this board, which represent the different departments. And whenever someone triggers one of those actions on the row, you're going to get a strength for that action based on the positioning of the meeples on the company board. And certain actions cause the meeples to go out into America to run the company. So they'll go out and visit the facilities on the main game board, where they'll hang out and eventually provide income before returning to the company and needing to be redistributed again. And this is the logistics, right? You want to have meeples on your board. You want to have them in the departments within the company, which is an action to organize. And then you want to be able to send them out to the main game board so that when income is triggered, you can actually recall them to gain income as well. And so there's this sort of logistical system that you have to manage, because when somebody triggers an action, if there's no one in the relevant departments on your player board, you don't get to do anything. You just have to sit there and look sad.
Yeah.
There's also route building, where you're going to be building your industries on the board, connecting up cities, and you want to try to create chains. There is player board development, as I said, in 2 different capacities. You can buy new departments for your board, which will make your different actions more efficient based on how you've distributed your meeples, your workers across the board. And also the 4 industries, you can develop those using the R&D points, as we said. They're actually sliders that slide out the side of the player board, and as they slide out, they get new tokens on them, which you can then put onto the board to build those industries. And as you put them out, you will uncover income that you can gain later whenever income is triggered. But if you don't have a worker in the region when income is triggered, you won't get any income, and then you'll have to sit there and look sad.
The game is a lot of being sad if you sequence things out of turn. So I think, I don't know if you mentioned, like, the game, on your turn, you pick one of those 4 actions, and it's an I choose, you follow mechanism. And if you can time it so you can do something that gets you a benefit and nobody else can do anything, then you have a great turn and they're very sad about it.
So I was going to say, I've played this 4 times. I played it 3 times with the actual Kickstarter when it delivered, and once on the show on BGA with Johnny, where we didn't really know the rules properly, but we're desperately trying to get the live stream in before the Kickstarter ended. So you can go see us muddling through that and eventually figuring it out towards the end of the game. But once I played it 3 times in real life with people who'd played it before and had been sitting with it for a while, and this is not something that really comes across in the BGA implementation for obvious reasons, is that you can look at people's companies and see where their meeples are. And you can look at the main game board and see where they can get income. And it might well be worth to you to take a slightly subpar action just because right now, nobody's in a good position to benefit. Like, it would be really bad for at least 1 or possibly 2 other players at the table. So there's quite a lot of like passive player interaction where you're looking at other people's game states and trying to figure out where they can be more or less efficient and then subvert that.
Yeah, because it's not maximum. You're not there to maximize your points. You're there to beat everybody else.
Well, exactly right, Barry. And I really like that about this game, but I can see how some people could get caught off guard, especially if they're unfamiliar with it.
Correct, yeah. Like, your first couple of games are going to be... Somebody's going to be sad. and that's just the way it works. I've played... I was just checking while you were chatting there. I've played 15 times, 7 of which were solo, and I think I've beaten Andrew Carnegie, the Automa, like twice. Like, he's not easy to beat if you ever were to play it solo. It seems to be that the AI always picks the worst option for you. I don't know how it manages to do it. And so you really start to understand, okay, I just need to be a little bit on everything to be picking up incremental benefits for that income, for that, what's coming next, the planning, the programming. You know that East is going to be triggered 3 out of the next 4 actions. And you're like, well, how can I get people over there to get them back? Because you don't have to bring everybody back. You can bring a single person back to trigger income.
Yeah.
And then, so if you can get enough people down there before those sort of 3 actions in a row, you can trigger 3 incomes on the subsequent turns. And if you don't see that, because it might be your first game, or it's not been, you've just not twigged, you've just not grokked that that's what's going to happen, you can take that first guy back, and then you get nothing for 2 turns. You're just like, no.
Yeah, so it's there is an element of there's a very strong element of resource management in the game as well, where you're managing money and also what are called goods, which I think are just sort of a catch-all for everything that's not money. But you're building railways and you're building banks and you're building bridges. So, factories as well. So you're building all these different things out of goods. And when you send people out from your player board, I mean, there's the 4 basic actions in the game, right? One of which is move the people around your player board. And that strength of that action is going to depend on how many people you have in your human resources departments. And then there's the R&D action, which just gives you a number of R&D points to spend on developing your player board and also on infrastructure on the main game board, which is largely going to help improve your incomes and also your end game scoring for the route building aspect of the game. So then the 3rd action, you get to put your people out on the board to build your infrastructure. So they're going to go out there and they're going to build those buildings, the bridges, the factories, the banks, and houses that you'll have researched on your player board. And when you put them out, the workers will move from your player board into the region where you place the disc. And then they'll be able to contribute to income collection in a minute. But also you've got the action that lets you buy new departments for your player board as well. So you've got meeples on your player board there, and they're going to be spent to bring those in from a marketplace that's sort of first come, first served. And the strength to which you can do that, again, depends where they are on your player board. And so you're trying to manage all of that, and then each time you take the action, it will move onto a region where you'll get this income, and you can call back any number of workers from that region, which will act as a multiplier for your income. So you can sort of elect to have it now or have it later, but the order in which the incomes are scored for the region is randomized during setup. So you can wind up in a situation like Barry described where the next 3 actions are all going to trigger income in the same region. So maybe you want 3 people there to call back one at a time, because you'll ultimately get more resources that way than if the region triggered just once and you called back all 3 at once. But this sort of managing of the meeple placement is absolutely key and quite difficult to pick up on BGA, I think, because in real life, players will be looking at your player board, which can be quite hard to see on the BGA interface, depending on your monitors and your computer setup. But in real life, it's very apparent. You can just look across and see Barry's got no one in human resources, or Barry's, that's actually not a great example. Barry's got no one in research and development, so I'm just going to trigger that a bunch of times before he can get people over there. So I can get all these research and development points, and he's just going to sit there and be sad about it.
I would say actually Carnegie is probably one of the most common feels bad moments games that I have. I think when you're playing 4-player or 3 or 4-player, the last player gets a token that they can use a different action from what you've picked once per game, and I think that's just necessary because it's so easy to for it to go bad for you.
I thought at 4 players everyone gets one of those.
Is it 4-player everyone gets one?
I think so.
I think 3-player you just get the last player gets one.
Fair enough, but if you don't spend it, it's worth points as well at the end of the game.
And we've not even discussed your charity work, as we all know, under Carnegie. A lot of work for charity.
That's another opportunity to miss out and feel bad, because
it gets expensive.
Every so often, an action will trigger the chance to engage in philanthropic endeavors, which actually take the form of about 5 or 6 menus across the top of the main game board. And each menu has a theme. So one menu might be points for a number of different kinds of buildings. So for example, there'll be 4 or 5 options on there, and there will be points for building all your bank, or for each of your banks that you've built, points for each of your houses that you've built. Another menu might be points for the amount of research you've done in the southern region, or the western region, or the eastern region, And so all these different menus, your first purchase on the menu will be relatively cheap, and then it will get increasingly more expensive as the game goes on. But of course, the more opportunities you have to make these donations, the more endgame scoring you'll unlock for yourself. And then if you fulfill them, you'll get bonanza points. But if you don't have the money when the opportunity to donate comes around, then you will not be able to buy one. And although your next chance will be cheaper because you have fewer total donations, you will have fewer overall opportunities.
Yeah. So, as I said, with the I choose you follow, it means everybody gets an equal number of opportunities. So if you miss out on one, there's not unreasonable portion of your points missing. And in terms of costs, it goes 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. And that jump from 5 to 10 is the hardest one to get to, because you're not making enough money.
Yeah, exactly. So I found playing this in real life with people who are quite well across it, it plays at a really fast pace, which I really, really like. I find there's very little downtime because I'm really interested in everything that's happening. The I choose you follow mechanism means we're all taking sort of relatively quick actions in quick succession, and we're engaged with the board state. I also found that I've written here actually that I thought it was really reminiscent of Terra Mystica. As a fan of that, what do you think about that comparison?
I can only see that as far as the research and the things coming off your board unlock your income potential.
Well, there's an element of territory contention.
Yeah.
It's not nearly as bad as Terra Mystica, where the spot's gone, it's gone.
Yeah, I can see it.
But there's a few spots, particularly the routes themselves connect up big cities. So if you can get into the big city with one token, you're present there, but then they're connected up by smaller roads and that you can easily be blocked on because they only have one spot. There's also really tight resource management, which I thought was quite reminiscent of Terra Mystica. where you never have enough priests.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I feel like both games want to be quite tactical, but also challenge you to have sort of overarching strategies as well. Just not be too fixated on how you're going to achieve those with the smaller steps.
Yeah. No, I can see it. I guess, I mean, I very much like Terra Mystica, and I like Carnegie as well, so...
so there we
share
go.
Some things
Well, in
common.
conclusion, then, I do think there's a lot of replayability here. The game doesn't significantly change play to play, but there's randomization in that action board. The rows are dynamic and can be changed. And I think that the game is sort of dynamic and there's enough player interaction.
If you have the Kickstarter version, or if you have the retail version, you can now buy the extra buildings, which does add some variety. So what your workers can do in your office changes game to game.
Yeah, even in the retail version, there is more building tiles than will be used in a single game. So the way it'll sort of work is you'll set up a marketplace for, these are the departments you can purchase to enhance your player board. You'll kill off a bunch of tiles, leaving only a limited selection. And then at the start of the game, in reverse turn order, I think everyone will get to draft one tile. And that already starts you off with a bit of asymmetry, and then it just sort of further develops from there with this first come, first served marketplace situation as well. And yeah, and that's really nice. I mean, I would happily play Carnegie almost any time. I think in terms of these sort of heavy logistical Euro games, I mean, I think it's a 3.8, so it's not considered amazingly heavy, but I also think it's got some novel concepts that are a little unusual.
I think it's hard to come back to sometimes, but once you get it,
yeah,
it's fine. It's just if you don't see it early on, much like Terra Mystica again, right? If you ruin your first turn in Terra Mystica, you're gonna have a bad time. And the same thing here. If you don't immediately remember what you're supposed to be doing, you're gonna have a bad time.
Yeah, but I do think overall, actually, I think that Carnegie tends to be shorter, at least feel shorter than Terra Mystica, and also less downtime.
Less downtime, yeah. I don't know. Maybe there is no Terra Mystica better, and I think people will play it with no Terra Mystica better. So
yeah,
I think Carnegie's often got a lot of. I don't want to do any of these right now. Let me look at what your boards have. So I'm gonna. Right, well, that's going to screw you the most, so I'll pick that.
Maybe there's a bit more opportunity for AP in Carnegie in that regard.
Yeah, I'd say that is.
Yeah. But overall, I think if you like these sort of fast, punchy Euros, if you're not too concerned about the potential for misplays or the offset for tight time and consideration being sort of feel bad or missed opportunities. I think Carnegie is great, and I'd happily play it anytime someone wanted to get it out. And that's why I wanted to include it in the podcast today, because I was like, I can't believe I haven't talked about it since the Kickstarter delivered.
It is good. I just picked other games I'd been more into for the month. So the other game I'll pick back up is another card game, Arkham Horror, the card game. Restarted the Innsmouth campaign and hoping to finish that over the next few days. So Arkham Horror, if you don't know, published by Fantasy Flight Games and designed by Nate French and now MG Newman, is a cooperative card game where players take on the role of investigators battling the horrors of the mythos. That's like H.P. Lovecraft. In various scenarios are generally across a campaign, though there are standalone scenarios. During the campaign, you'll improve your deck by upgrading and replacing cards as you earn XP for investigating and vanquishing monsters. Each scenario is very much a race against the clock to get what you need done in time before the game advances you to your doom. With only 3 actions per player per turn, do you draw? Do you play a card? That was going to help you in a bit. Do you fight a monster? Do you search for a clue? Do you perform an action that's on a card? Do you move? Do you dodge? Do you gather resources? There's always too much to do and not enough time. And all of that's before you get, at the start of the round, you get a bad card from the Mythos deck, which you have to deal with in its own way, whether it's a test or whether it's a monster that's come out of nowhere. And so it just grinds you down, even as you're kind of getting stronger as you go along. So we played one of the early games we played on the channel, Mike, Arkham Horror.
Yeah.
Many moons ago. You'll have to go back to the start.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of our first big hits, actually, and I think that's because you'd managed to get a core set really early on in the release, and people were super hyped for it, and I didn't realize how much embedded love there was, or excitement for that release. So when you brought it along, and we got to play the first episode of the first campaign and the first core set, people were really hyped to come and watch that. That was one of the first big videos on the show.
Yeah, it was enjoyable then, and it's arguably even more enjoyable now as things have kind of gotten bigger. There's more variety. There's more things to do. If you've not seen the game, it's a card game. You draw cards, you get resources, you pay for your cards. The uncertainty element is dealt with a bag of tokens, chaos tokens, ranging from great unique character effects to an automatic fail. But usually it's some sort of negative modifier for any of these skill checks. So you have to put in cards from your hand to make these checks easier because you want to succeed. But all that does is reduce your hand size, give you fewer options. Speaking of, games that grind you down, Arkham Horror gives you this dread and this feel of losing over time by giving you all these kind of options. So it's a co-op game. You can, of course, help each other out. But it really shines as a campaign where you're earning XP over those 8 scenarios, upgrading your deck, getting more attuned to your character. It's like, oh, this is a really cool power. This card would work really well with it. And just what I was saying there, like I've only got into Lorcana just in that last set because the base game wasn't terribly interesting, and I was only lukewarm on the core set of Arkham. But now there's like a much better selection of cards for deck building. And it's just a game that's gotten better as the options have kind of expanded. And like I say, still playing it now. Hope to finish some more campaigns this year. But yeah, I've not played it for months, so good to be back in it.
And so you've revisited that quite a lot since we first played it on the show.
Yeah, so it was that, and I mean, played Marvel Champions as well, played Lord of the Rings LCG, so they're the co-op games from Fantasy Flight, the co-op card games from Fantasy Flight. They've all got their own unique spin on things, but Arkham, I'd say, is potentially the best of the three, but everybody's got their favourites.
But what keeps you coming back to Arkham, that keeps you intrigued in that one? Yeah, especially over, say, the other LCGs like Lord of the Rings or Marvel Champions.
Yeah, I think Arkham's, the theme is good, and actually coming back knowing roughly what's going to happen can be advantageous, because if you do a blind playthrough where you're learning the story and stuff, you often get wrecked from something you don't know what's happening. And then when you kind of, okay, well, actually I need to prepare for scenario 5 and I've got to have a gun because I can only really hurt the boss with ranged combat. There'll be other ways of dealing with it within the game, but I don't want to have to travel 3 locations over to pick up the magic powder to sprinkle on them. If I just have a big gun, I'll go back and shoot them. So you can kind of play, you can get better at the game and get better at the scenarios, and there's a lot of variety in each of the investigators, which can be said the same now as the other games get bigger. Like Lord of the Rings is kind of done. They're republishing some of the sets and some of the cards. Champions continues to get bigger as they publish more heroes and more villains to play against. And Arkham, again, as they publish more investigators, more cards. And you can do a lot more things. Like it was arguably too confined within the core set. There's only so many different cards you can give somebody. And now there's a lot of interesting ways of dealing with problems. You need to collect clues. Well, I could reduce the difficulty of the tests to 0 so I can't fail. That's one way of doing it. Or I could boost my stat to obscene numbers. Or I could look at ways of picking up clues by defeating monsters, and you've got all these different ways of doing it. So each time you go back with a different investigator, it's a very different feeling for how you're moving through that story. And then similarly, there's a whole bunch of stories now, whether that's the campaign or the standalone, and it's just a solid game system.
And so if someone were excited to jump into the system now, where should they start off?
Still just the core set. Now the core set is just a much reduced 3-scenario campaign, but you'll be given decks. So they've repackaged the core set now. It's the same cards roughly loosely, but you get pre-built investigator decks, 5 different types for each of the sort of factions in it, and the 3 scenarios. And if you like that, know that the game can just be a whole lot bigger. More stories to go through and more options for what your investigator can do. So you can then move on to any of the scenarios. You can play them in order that they came out in, but you could also just jump into the most recent one, and you'll have enough cards really to be able to take it on. The difficulty is adjustable. If you think, actually, I don't have what I need to beat this on hard difficulty, I'll just go down to standard or easy. But if you're like, now I've got so many cards, it's too easy for me, then you can go all the way up to expert and put in more of those negative modifiers into the chaos bag in order to make it a challenge again. So you can really tweak it to your skill level as well. If you just want the story, play it on easy. If you want a real challenge where you've got to really think about what your decks are going to do on your 5th time playing the scenario, then you can go up to sort of expert and still have it be quite difficult.
And so if I'm playing through a campaign and I fail a scenario, do I have to start over or do I reattempt that scenario?
Depends. Some will end the campaign, but very, very rarely. Usually you'd be towards the end anyway. Most are fail forward. You'll get a bad resolution, but you'll potentially have a knock-on negative effect in a further scenario. Or you might just not get the rewards for that scenario. You'll miss out on some allies. There might be a sort of scenario-specific ally that if you rescue them, you can then put that into your deck and have them in future scenarios. However, if they get grabbed by the beasties, then they're not going to be able to come back, so they're put back in the box and never seen again.
They're dead.
Exactly. But no, it's just solid, and being able to play a whole campaign in a relatively short time frame instead of, say, one scenario a month is not enough to really keep the feel going forward. So I've got the newest box of Arkham, which is sort of midsummer type vibes, but I've not had a chance to bust that out yet. Hopefully soon. And the very last thing I've been into is getting back into dollies. So I've been out of miniatures games and painting for a pretty long time, but I've been going to Salute, which is a convention by South London Warlords. They have it every year. That's the Salute 51. Been going for quite some time. And they have it at the Excel these last few years. It's pretty big as far as conventions go. And I ended up picking up the rules for Armada. That's Kings of War Armada, published by Mantic Games, and it's a high fantasy spin on the naval warfare game Black Seas, and that's designed by Gabriel Tolentino. And it's fundamentally the same game as Black Seas, but it adds fantasy abilities and wizards. So if you were to think about what it's most like, think like X-Wing. I know you've played a lot of X-Wing, but it's much more of a heavier war game feel, right? You're chucking D10s and D6s for things. You're measuring range. You don't just have templates or can shoot as far as you can see type thing. And I've actually not had a chance to play it yet. I'm still painting up my dollies. Here, I'll show on the screen. I've got a couple of dollies here. Little boats sailing around. And
so if you're watching this on, if you're listening to this on,
if you're listening to this, it's in black and white.
you can find the video versions on Spotify and on our YouTube channel as well.
You put videos on Spotify these days, living in the future.
Yeah, Spotify does videos. Yeah, I didn't even know. They put the whole thing up there.
Wow. And so I'm still painting them up, and I hope to get first game next week, end of next week sometime. But I did also purchase a whole bunch of, well, not a whole bunch of paints, but there is a new range of paints from Army Painter, the Fanatic starter set. 11 paints and a little mini came with it, but I don't really care for the mini. And just getting back into painting. Like, I used to enjoy painting when I was a young man, sort of, you know, teens. And then I did play some miniatures games 10 years ago, and I didn't particularly enjoy painting because I had loads of stuff to paint, and then I got rid of it all and just didn't have minis games. But now I can store a whole fleet in like a single drawer, like an IKEA storage drawer, and I can have a whole game's worth of stuff in like 2 drawers. I didn't know that much about the game system, but now having kind of comparatively looked at it at some of the other games around, so that if you go back in time, Games Workshop's original Man O' War, and then their Dreadfleet product, which wasn't particularly well received, and then there's Dystopia Wars, which was like a steampunk airship sea battle thing, as well as Black Seas and this more historical ones. This actually seems like it's pretty good, but I don't see a lot of people talking about it, so I'm hoping I can get into it a bit more and find a community to play with.
So I think in the genre of tabletop miniatures games, I've really only scratched the surface of the most sort of basic ones. You know, I've played the vast majority of the Games Workshop catalog, at least as it existed before the year 2010.
Yep.
I don't really have much experience with tabletop miniatures games outside of that. I'm trying to remember if we even dabbled in anything else. You know, I never played War Machine, which I feel like is the other big one. I guess I'm trying to put into context sort of our position as a representative of miniature games analysis. It sounds like you're looking for some lifestyle miniatures games to sort of get a bit more invested in. And
well, a lot of the people I play with play Shatterpoint, play Legion, right? So the 2 Star Wars ones. They'll play Marvel Crisis Protocol, which is the Marvel one. And I was just like, I'm not getting involved. Like, I don't want to store it. I don't want to keep all the scenery for it. At least this has the sort of flat scenery because it just got to be in the way of your boats. It doesn't have any height elements to it, which Malifaux had. And so I can keep everything quite neat. It's not so much that I'm looking for it to be a total lifestyle game, but you do want other people to be playing it, right?
So I guess what I'm trying to say really is I don't have much experience with miniatures games as a genre, or really new miniatures games either. I understand that there's a lot of rule sets coming out and going out there, but I will be excited to hear vicariously about your experiences with this Armada game and how that goes.
I think you'd like playing it. Like I said, it's sort of X-wingy. You got your boats. You maybe put different upgrades on your boats, and then it's templated in terms of your turning circles, and each ship can move a different distance. So there you need a tape measure or a ruler. It's just a little. It's just off being a board game. Like, it's just into the war game territory. So if you did want to investigate, it might be a good one for you.
So yeah, I suppose we're probably both in a position here where we're probably not looking for something as all-consuming as Warhammer, or as large a system.
To be fair, some people have just got into Old Hammer, so they've obviously brought back original fantasy Warhammer.
Yeah, I understand they've reissued Warhammer Fantasy Battles because people really like it. And they were sad.
Yeah, but then I've not seen either of those two guys for like a month and a half. Just coming out, we're playing Warhammer. All right, fine.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing about a lot of these games, is they become sort of very much a sort of a whole endeavor, Yeah. But it's not even the amount of time they take to play, because I'd be hypocritical of me. I play very long, complicated board games, but I think the key difference, is that the board games typically account for more players, and you don't need to own anything to access it. And theoretically, I can teach you the rules on the day for most of them. Caveat, Europa Universalis, price of power. So largely, they're just more accessible. Whereas something like Warhammer, I can't really. I mean, I could run an introductory game and teach you the basics, and if you didn't have anything, I could do that. But it wouldn't really feel like a proper game of Warhammer. You have to really have your own army, your own army list you've designed, your own figures. You need to be across the rules well enough for us to have a competitive game. And that just makes it a much bigger and more involved endeavor.
No, it makes sense. Like I said, I've not been in miniatures games for a decade again now. But the concept of being able to store a whole game or a whole fleet and all the game rules and stuff in a couple of drawers was appealing enough to jump back in.
All right, well, we shall wait and see once Barry's played a few games of Armada how he gets along. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Or do whatever you do on podcasts. Follow them. Click on
subscribe.
Is it subscribe to podcasts? Like it. Add it to your list. Whatever you do. Whatever platform this is on.
We're professional podcasters now, Mike. Come on.
Yeah, but I added this to like 5 different outputs. Like, I don't know what they all do. I just told you to do it.
Let us know where you're listening to this.
Yeah, how did you find this? It's not via me, because I didn't write anything about it. I have a few more games on the list here, but I'm actually just going to jump to one more, and then we'll call it a day, because this podcast is quite long already.
Yep.
And you'll just have to come back once you've listed it on your favorites to come and find out the next episode. So I'm going to jump straight to Skyrise, because this was a Kickstarter that recently delivered, and people have been playing it. And Skyrise is a long overdue Kickstarter that was eventually delivered by Roxley Games. And so kudos to them for actually getting it done and delivering it to a high standard as well, albeit very, very overdue. And what this is actually a redevelopment, reimplementation of a game called Metropolis, which was designed by Sébastien Pachot and originally came out 2008. Sébastien Pachot, probably best known for much lighter games like Jaipur, the 2-player head-to-head camel market game, Jamaica, the game of racing pirates around in a circle and trying to hold things in your hold, and a game called The River, in which you were progressing down a river, a Euro game in which you were going down a river. And I don't remember much more about it. I played it at a convention when it came out and then never saw it again. And then this is a co-design with a chap called Adam Weiss, who has got 5 other credits to his name, although I'm unfamiliar with any of them. But the most recent of those, actually, of his 5 credits, one of them is upcoming, so it's not even out. The other was a game called Guerrilla Marketing, which is 2019 Roxley title.
I've played it.
How was it?
No, I was only played 3 players, so it was a big party game. But I only had 3 players to play. It was fine. I forget exactly what you had to do, but like you were given categories and had to come up with funny company names and things like that.
A party game of naming ridiculous products, movies, and companies. This sounds like a sort of a corporate pitching version of Fun Employed.
I did play Fun Employed, but I'm talking many moons ago.
It's Fun Employed, the one where you sort of randomize a CV and then have to fake a job interview with your weird credentials. Adam Weiss also did one called Poetry Slam, which is a 2018 Mayday Games title, Mask of the Red Death, 2018 IDW Games, and Head of the Household, 2017 Foxmind. I've done his entire credentials because that's all of them so far. Sebastian has about 50 games to his name, so we'll go through them all. And then the last designer credited on the game is Gavin Brown, who you will likely know as a major contributor to Dice Throne, particularly the Marvel Dice Throne stuff, and also a co-designer of Brass Birmingham. So I was very intrigued by Skyrise when it was on Kickstarter, particularly because of the attachment of Gavin Brown and the success of Brass Birmingham, and also because Roxley do really nice deluxe editions, and I thought I want to get a little bit involved in this. And the art is also Andrew Bosley. Andrew Bosley famously is Everdell. So if you like the art in Everdell, then you'll probably like Andrew Bosley. He also did Blood Bowl Team Manager.
Well, I never.
So there you go. Favorite of Barry's, which we did play on a charity live stream. I'm not sure if you can still find that on the show. Possibly you can. Possibly only if you're a patron. But anyway, moving on. Skyrise it's 2 to 4 players. As far as I'm aware, there's no solo mode. It is touted as being relatively light. It's a 2.6 on BGG, and I think that's fairly accurate. It is not got very many complex mechanisms. There are a few. It is an auctioning game. It says here on BGA that it takes 30 to 90 minutes. I reckon that's a bit of a fib. I think it depends on your player count. 2 people who are really across it, lasting 30 minutes, sure, probably. But it's an auction game, and I think it wants to be 4 players. It says here best at 4. I've only played it once at 4. And it is a game of 2 eras. In the first era, you're going through auctioning rounds where each auction will be headed off by the winner of the last auction. And then in the second era, everyone will get some new pieces to auction with, and you'll do pretty much the same thing again. There's a small amount of mid-era scoring, and also you'll have some asymmetrical player powers that you'll decide at the end of the first era. And then at the end of the second era, there's a much bigger endgame scoring, which will decide the game. And in Skyrise, the world is decayed or destroyed, or possibly just for shits and giggles, we've built floating platforms in the sky. But there's land sailing in the sky, and famous architects from across time have come anachronistically to the floating island to build buildings in various different styles. I think this is a nod to the Fritz Lang movie Metropolis, which is, of course, the title the original game had. Although what it has to do with Metropolis, I can't quite fathom. But maybe someone who's more cultured and educated than me could explain it in a comment on the YouTube video. But you have sort of famous artists and architects from across time that you can play as in the game. There is no asymmetrical powers for that. So it doesn't really matter who you play. It's just sort of fun novelty choice. But you'll get a series of buildings that you will have in your play area, and the buildings are small, medium, and large, but underneath they have numerical values, none of which are duplicated. So every player gets a unique set of buildings with unique values. Not completely unreminiscent of the sun tiles in Ra, except unlike Ra, you will never exchange the tiles back and forth between players, and the auctions are not isolated to one round, and you have many more buildings. But what the board is 5 floating islands, albeit the 5th island, which connects the other 4 large islands, is a tiny little one with just 4 regions on it. All the rest have regions that are spread out and sort of amorphous. It's not a grid. It's very sort of unique in different shapes, with regions bordering usually 2 or 3 other regions, 4 regions, but there are dead ends and things like that amongst the regions. And they'll also contain little artistic things that could be important based on certain cards that come out and things like that, like blimps or windmills, or be adjacent to lakes. And so there is this sort of complex scoring that the game puts forward, which will be building your buildings in the regions. So ultimately, the auctions are winning the right to put a building that you possess into the region, and then you will, at the end of the game, have access to various different scoring conditions based on where you've put the building. And so it's one of those games where each region will have different meaning to different players based on the strategies they're going for and the different win conditions. There's a sort of a set win condition where the person who's built the most tall buildings on each island will get some points. Then there's 2 open objectives that will be randomly distributed at the beginning of the game, which might be surround your buildings with blimps, or build over the bridges, which are connecting up the islands, or it could be build around the lakes, for example. And then each region has a different color. Well, actually, there's 4 colors, and each region is one of the 4 colors. And as you build in, each region also contains a token. and most of the tokens match the 4 colors, and as you collect them, you will increase the amounts of points you get for those regions. But there are other kinds of tokens too. One of the main ones is access to scoring for these patrons, which is effectively just a hidden scoring mechanism. So when you collect a token, you can look at the patron's hidden scoring, and that'll give you some points for the token you've just collected. But nobody knows its value unless they get a matching token, and then they can also look at the hidden patron scoring. So the auctioning is for these regions, and what makes the game sort of unique and weird is that the player who is setting off the auction will pick one of their buildings with this numerical value. They can look around the table and see all the numerical values every other player has access to, so they'll know the possibility of whether or not their building can be beat. They can start with any number they have access to, so they could start low and see what happens, or they could start high, potentially already excluding some players from even bidding based on what numbers people have and what they've already put out. But the thing is here, when you place a bid, you place it onto the board into one of the regions, and then the next player, when they play a bid, they put it into an adjacent region. So even though you're all putting out bids at the same time, and only the highest number at the end of the round of bidding, and it's not one round of bidding, it will keep going until everyone passes and one player is left with the highest bid. But each bid is to secure a different region. So you're not all bidding on the same region, but in fact playing this sort of, you're playing this spatial puzzle where each bid you put out is for the region that bid is placed in and not for the previous regions. So each higher bid changes what it's bidding for, what the whole bid is for. And then nobody can bid for that region. They'd have to outbid you by putting a higher bid into a different region. So you're sort of really keenly aware of what's going on around you, what everyone else is trying to bid for, and also how many spaces there are. Because as the board starts to get occupied with buildings, you start to create these sort of little pockets of regions. And if there's only, say, 3 spaces or 4 spaces within the pocket, there's only 4 maximum bids in that region. Or maybe the bidding will actually go into a dead end, and then the auction will just stop, and whoever put the last building out at the end of the dead end will claim that region. There is also slightly more regions than there are total buildings. So even though you might have an opportunity to potentially have a region right away, because if there's a pocket that contains one region, you start an auction, your first bid wins it, because there's nowhere for anyone else to place any other bids. And so you'll just win that region. But if it's not supremely valuable to you, it might be better to wait because there are some leftover regions at the end of the game. It is weird and very abstract, and I've seen open auctions. I've seen, auctions that are open and also, continue until everyone passes before. Wroth, which is kind of similar, famously ends after just one round of bidding. So it becomes very sort of like cutthroat in that regard. But, this keeps going around until everyone passes or runs out of space. Very strange, though, very unique, a very intriguing puzzle. Although I have to say, for a very light game, towards the end of it, it became very calculational and quite AP driven, or quite AP prone. So I'd be interested to try it again. It's very peculiar and different and interesting. The production value of the Roxley edition that I got is off the charts. Like, it's really good. They've done a beautiful job, but I don't know if I wouldn't rather just play Raw.
There's a lot of worse games than Ra, though, so...
Yeah, but, this is... and that's true, And for what it's worth, this is different and a bit novel and a bit interesting. But it's not super cheap. I don't know how you could find it at the moment. I don't think it's at retail yet. I assume that it will be coming to retail, albeit without all the fancy buildings. So if you bought the Kickstarter version, you probably have a ton of plastic miniatures. You might have got the retail version through Kickstarter, but you will have wooden pieces in the retail version and tokens in the Kickstarter version, you've got plastic miniatures and a plastic board with, or sorry, not a plastic board, but a plastic elevation to the board. But yeah, I'm just not quite sure what to make of it because, Ra is very fast and very punchy and sort of has a similar kind of feel to the auctions. Whereas, this became quite calculational with everyone getting very sort of heads down and very focused on the sort of the spatial puzzle. And interestingly as well, the first era ends when somebody runs out of buildings. The second era ends when everybody runs out of buildings. So it's very possible for one player to be left putting out buildings on their own at the end, which could be a massive drawback if they can't get the regions they want. But for me, I was left being the last player with buildings to put out, just collecting the regions I wanted. And I did win, albeit in a game that scored 140 points odd. I won by about 5 points, so it was a very close game. And the person in second had finished first, and they'd collected an extra 10 points for getting out all their buildings first in the final round, or the final era.
Seems fairly reasonable. I do like the idea of that sort of merged mechanics, the spatial awareness bidding. Like, don't think I've seen that anywhere else, and it seems like it works.
Yeah, it led to this really sort of interesting dynamic where people were, sort of potentially jumping in with a high number to get a region they really wanted, and then the next player had to sit there and think, well, actually, in order to outbid you, I have to place this in a region that I don't want as much as this number, but I don't want you to get that region either because that's clearly very good for you,
Yeah.
There was also like this sort of interesting concept as well where like somebody would end a region, or close a region, and that would create a pocket of just one region, and then they'd be starting the next auction. So then they could put out a really low number and just grab a region with it. But as I mentioned earlier, that felt like quite a strong play. And so players in our game were starting to try and do that, trying to contrive these scenarios where they could just quickly grab a region with a low number. But actually, I don't think that necessarily benefited them because the regions they were grabbing were potentially not very valuable to them.
Mm-hmm.
They were just kind of more, it felt like a good opportunity to use a low number.
Yeah. Start recognizing those patterns and playing the game differently if you play more. So,
yeah, a really sort of interesting and odd thing. It's been getting really sort of positive feedback across the board game sphere. I had quite high expectations from it, actually, particularly given the involvement of Gavin Brown and the sort of the popularity or the positive things I'd heard about it when it was first played. A number of other creators had told me they really, really, really liked it. So perhaps my expectations were just a little too high, but I felt like towards the end of the game, it got very sort of heads down and calculational. And I was expecting maybe a little bit more banterous, auction-y shenanigans. But I'll definitely be happy to give it another play and sort of see where I land after that. So I will update the podcast in the future if I get it to the table again.
Cool beans.
And if you have the opportunity to play it, I certainly recommend trying it because it is unique and weird.
Here's the point in the podcast where I realise I've been on mute the whole time. Nice one. So, always more games to talk about, though. But perhaps not today.
No, not today. That's going to wrap up episode 2 of the podcast. Now, we've got some exciting stuff coming up to talk about in the next episode. Stuff that I was going to talk about here. I'm going to go away and try and play them again. I'm going to have a look at Merchants of the Dark Road, see if I can't bring you back some thoughts on that. And Barry's going to update you on how he gets on with Arkham Horror and Armada in the future. So make sure you follow the podcast, link it, favorite it, put it in a list, subscribe to it, whatever you need to do.
Whatever buttons you see, you smash them.
And if you like this, yeah, exactly. Don't report. I mean, unless you report positive things, back to us. And if you like this sort of independent board game content, you want us to spend more time doing this and more time bringing you this kind of lovely stuff, then please do consider checking out the Patreon as well. I will probably be talking about Horror on the Orient Express in a future podcast episode, which was a cooperative game that was on Kickstarter And the reason I can bring you that content is because I've been playing it with the patrons. So if you'd like to play games with me, potentially on TTS, on forthcoming Kickstarter stuff, you want me to teach it to you so you can play it before you back it, consider coming to the Patreon and getting involved.
We need a sign off.
Bye-bye.
Bye.